Tim Boyle and his co-founder James Colley have recently experienced a 9-figure exit from their business, Whiparound. But every business has humble beginnings, and also there's a critical moment of commitment.
And so we rocked off to the bank and borrowed some money and put our money where our mouth was, so to speak. And once you do that, I think you're beholden to yourself that you've got to try and make something of it.
Every person has a superpower, hopefully several. But if that superpower happens to be sales, hold on, some exciting things can happen.
He could walk into a room and people could tell us 5 reasons why they didn't want to buy it, and he'd walk out with a credit card number and I'd walk out and go, what on earth just happened there?
Outsourcing development at the start of a business makes perfect sense, but there's always a moment where things could go wrong.
And so we were back online, but that was a very tough lesson that, right, we don't actually have the keys to our own kingdom here, and we need to have somebody in the business who at least has total control and oversight over the platform.
It's alluring as hell to sell into the USA, but man, it can be brutal.
The world works against you. It is designed for you not to go and become an entrepreneur. 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd rock up to our office in Ponsonby Road and start cold calling American trucking companies.
Taking investors' money can mean governance, and governance can sometimes work against you.
And so to be able to lose my seat at the board, which I thought was contributing a lot of value, was just a bit gutting. Not just for me personally, it wasn't an ego thing at all. It was just, I knew that the value that I could bring to the business was not being appreciated. I woke up one morning and by that afternoon, I wasn't even a director on the company I'd started. And
Tim Boyle, welcome to the show, my friend.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here.
On a number of levels.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. We'll talk about that later. But Whiparound is the story that we're really going to be telling today. And in New Zealand, that tends to mean that you're going to your mates to get some money together to buy a gift or something. So is that part of the origin story of the company, that you whipped around some capital to kind of get this thing started, or does it mean something different altogether?
It doesn't. I think it was actually just the byproduct of that was probably the 200th name that we'd thrashed around and didn't like, and it just ended up sort of being a little bit of a reflection of our initial product, which was a pre-trip vehicle inspection. And so we're sort of trying to find this, what are drivers doing when they're inspecting their vehicle kind of symbology, and Whiparound came out of my co-founder James's mouth, and we thought that is as good as anything. We'll just run with it.
Make the decision and move on.
The irony in that, I think, was that subsequent to the business being called Whiparound, we ended up over the years having a bunch of ex-Pushpay people coming on board, and the connection to the donations and tithing that Pushpay focused their business on, and the name Whiparound became a bit of an inside joke. But no, it was nothing to do with that. It was purely the pre-trip vehicle inspection process.
Yeah, got it. Do you recall any of the other names that you had entertained that were cringy or amusing?
Oh, you could probably guess half of them, because when you're looking at sort of essentially a checklist, and now I see businesses called these things and they're doing very well, but, checkmate, tick, green tick, go, anything to do with the most obvious naming convention of a checklist you could think of, we probably had a crack at. And the only problem, and a good lesson learnt, is whiparound.com was not available as a domain. So we ended up with whip-around.com as our original URL. And that caused us all sorts of problems when it came to our accent, dealing with America, trying to tell people what our email address was or our domain was, or all of that. So there was a few regrets in that. But in the end, Whiparound was an unusual enough name. People sort of, looked a bit sideways at you when you told them what it was.
Especially in the States, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's stuck in people's names.
Yeah.
It's stuck in people's memories a bit more than, something a little bit more benign.
Yeah. It's really interesting, the naming space. We'll spend a few minutes on this and I'll share a couple of stories, because I think that we can either overcook or undercook it. I chair a business called Matomo, and they'd gone through a rebranding, renaming process. And the 2 founders had kicked around a whole bunch of different names, and they landed on this made-up name, Matomo. And then someone looked at them and said, you realize that's the combination of your 2 names, Matt and Tomas. And they were like, oh my God, it actually is. And they hadn't clocked that was the case, but it stuck with the company. Potentia, my first company, when I named that business, Latin for power, empower, and a whole bunch of other things, and the naming space was wide open. Now I've looked again a couple of times of recent years, so there was no Potentia in the world of any type or form. Now there's about 25 with different URLs, including the very large, very aggressive Australian-based VC called Potentia. When I talk about founding Potentia, people are like, the VC firm, that really aggressive deal do? I'm like, no, I'm an angel investor, not a VC. And Ambit, which was the AI platform player that I had for a number of years, we went through the process of considering rebranding the business because we're in the AI conversational platform space, in the very, very early days back in 2017. And I was pushing the notion of the flow, conflow, reason flow, this kind of thing, because it was a flow of conversation. But one of my co-founders, Gareth, was really anti it because of the connotations around the monthly event that happens for females. And so it got a really sticking point. So we just ended up sticking with this name, Ambit. So right now in the world, it's actually really bloody difficult to find a space that is open from a naming perspective. And so where I've landed with a lot of people when they're looking at doing something rebranding wise is just make something up. Just make a name up that is catchy, that you can own that space around, that you can tell a bit of a story around.
Absolutely. And the other, thorn in the side is IP and trademarking. And as much as I thought I'd learnt that lesson a few times over, even the business I'm spinning up now called Help Genie, by the time you get into the actual, you run the ruler over it and there's many ways that we can, get some protection on this. And we've got it in New Zealand, and then you get to Australia and you get the initial green light. And then all of a sudden, no, there's actually, 8 different infringing things. And so if it's not the naming convention, it is the trademarking, it's the URLs, it's all of that. So I agree. I mean, it's an absolute minefield now.
Totally agree. Yeah. Hey, so you came from a background in commercial real estate and you founded a company with your co-founder, James Colley.
Yep.
And you went into the space of commercial vehicle inspections. That's not a logical connection between those two things. So what was the origin story of how you identified the opportunity?
I've sort of told this story over the years to try and draw some connection, because people told me that if, I had some domain expertise, it would resonate with investors or what have you. And the connection there was that when I was in commercial real estate, I was in the industrial space. So I was dealing with a lot of freight and logistics and equipment operators and things like that in the day-to-day, and selling and leasing properties. That was the broadest brush I could probably connect. And the real genesis of Whip Around was that James, my co-founder, who fortunately, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is still a great mate of mine, we were actually living together at the time, and we both had the same sort of spark that we wanted to start a business. We wanted to build equity in something. We both had, a fairly entrepreneurial bent. And so we sort of thrashed around ideas. It was pretty handy being both single men at the time and having enough time to sit at the pub over a few beers or the dining table at home. And he worked in the freight industry proper and worked for some big organizations and sort of the sales side more than the operational side. But it was over a Christmas break where the law in New Zealand had changed, the Health and Safety at Work Act. And so he was sort of just observing a lot of the contract trucking companies that were having to now deal with increased paperwork, filling out a whole lot more forms and just sort of manual processes, that he thought there's a problem to solve here.
Yeah.
I think we should have a crack at it. And he did have sort of some early relationships with people that we could test the product on. And, I guess like the name Whip Around, we thought, right, this is a good enough place to start. That was really more of an idea than some of the things that we'd had. And so we rocked off to the bank and borrowed some money and put our money where our mouth was, so to speak. And once you do that, I think you're beholden to yourself that you've got to try and make something of it. It's a lot harder to kind of walk away and say, I can't be bothered.
Yeah.
And that was really the start point. Was James had a great idea. He'd seen the problem, and together we sort of managed to pull it together.
Yeah, those early moments of a business are really interesting because there's a number of decisions that you make. We've talked about the naming being one. You raise some capital from the bank, which means that you had to secure it against your own assets in some way, shape, or form, personal guarantees, that sort of thing. You're in commercial real estate, which I understand that's a personal risk kind of thing. So it's a commission-based game. James would have had probably a salaried job. Yep. And so at what point did you transition from it being a side hustle into being the thing that we committed to? Was that when you raised the money from the bank and that was to live on? Or was it?
No, the bank money was really just to get our initial, V1 product, our MVP off the ground. So we engaged a developer who built very simple sort of prototype dashboard, and 2 native mobile apps. Well, it was actually probably 1 to start with. And then we went and sort of shopped that around. And so we were still very much working in our day jobs. And this was really just to get a product in the market that we thought we could go and sell. And James tells a story where my naivety at that point, I thought, look, I think we could probably build this. We'll put it in the app store and we'll wake up in the morning and see how many people have paid us.
I love that story.
And if I'm sitting here now 10 years later, that was absolutely not what happened. But, at that point, I don't think we were necessarily, we were very much experimenting with it. We were seeing what the appetite for it was in the market. And then we got, I guess we didn't get any customers off that initial investment, but we learned enough about what our product needed to do and what the market looked like that we then went and raised a little bit more money off our families and friends, largely our families. And that just then sort of, intensified our product, build more functionality, particularly in sort of the back end, and the dashboarding side of things. And so we had sort of an actual saleable product at that point. And we were sort of ducking and weaving, certainly me being in real estate, having a fairly flexible, work-life balance, was able to sort of, and being based out in South Auckland doing industrial work, I was able to sort of fold meetings into my day and go and see people and make calls and whatnot. So, early doors, it was very much just building that initial product and seeing where it landed. And then, talking about inflection points, which, I know is something that you want to touch on. The biggest inflection point, I think, certainly around that time was James is great at sort of growth hacking. And so, far better than I ever was. He could very easily spin up all of our CRMs and, he's great at doing websites and setting up Stripe payment systems and all that sort of stuff. And and Google AdWords and, all those sort of things that you certainly did back then. And we got an inquiry from a large company in the US called Anheuser-Busch, who own Budweiser and, large beverage company. And they said, hey, we've seen your product. Are you DVIR compliant?
Hey, it's Josh. Thanks for being part of the show. Most founders don't just build one thing. They build many. The company, the team, and hopefully the legacy. JB Ware in New Zealand understands that your exit isn't an ending. It's the bridge to what you build next. Whether that's backing the next generation, funding what matters, or creating impact that compounds across decades. The best exits aren't measured in commas alone. They're measured in what those commas enable. 2 Commas is proudly partnered with JB Ware, building wealth that works as hard as you do.
And we thought, A, these guys are a big deal. B, what on earth is DVIR compliance? And, this is when we're out kicking down the doors of trucking companies in New Zealand and no one really wants to talk to us. And the old New Zealand attitude of, yeah, look, this is great. Why don't you come back in a few weeks and we'll have a think about it? And for something you're charging, $100 a month for at that point, the economies weren't really there. So we all of a sudden became experts in DVIR compliance. And that really was the start of what Whip Around, became, in that it opened our eyes to what the US state and federal level compliance requirements were for commercial motor vehicles. And there was just this huge industry around compliance. There was a real pain point. And so the conversations became very different. When we're talking to people in the US, how are you managing this? How are you doing your DVIR? Stands for Daily Vehicle Inspection Report, or Driver Vehicle Inspection Report, depending on who you talk to. And so that gave us a real, lane to focus on. These people have a real pain. We know exactly who they are. We can look at a truck and say, that's in this state, it's over this particular weight threshold, and it does this sort of job. They have to do what we do digitally. And so that's when we sort of decided, right, we'd better think a little bit more seriously about this and go and raise some proper money to be able, to sort of build a proper business behind it and give it a proper shot.
Got it. So when I think about a co-founding team, the classical rhetoric is that you've got a engineer, a salesperson, and a product person. And in reality, it's a lot grittier than that. But optimally, that's where you land, because you kind of cover off the critical skill sets to be able to build something. This is in the SaaS space, and understand the things that are going on in each part of that organization, plus drive those in the early days. You were both from kind of a sales-oriented background. So a lot of overlap, the Venn diagram, a lot of overlap of skills. Sounds like James kind of gravitated towards being the operations-y, technical kind of person. But in the early days, you borrowed some money, I'm guessing probably into the six figures, because to stand a prototype up in those days was, $100,000+ to be able to build something. Is that about right?
I think, yeah, well, that initial sort of phase I spoke about then, that was probably, I think, 50 grand, 60 grand we probably got away with.
Yep.
And the product was reasonably simple.
Pretty
at that
basic.
point. It did what it said it needed to do, and people paid us for it.
That's my question, actually. So I recently came across through network a buddy was working for a company for a year or so, and it was a company endeavoring to disrupt a space that they really had no experience in. And they'd spent, all told, they spent $4 million on building this product that I looked at it a couple of times and went, this just really is not going to work. I don't see the pain point as being pronounced enough for anyone to go down the path of utilizing this thing in the way that you imagine. And sure enough, down the path, they ended up killing the whole thing. But they really were deceived, maybe too strong a word, but they weren't effectively partnered with their development outsourcing company, who I won't name for obvious reasons, who essentially were just seeing them as a cash cow. And they took over $1 million from this company before they'd even stood up a basic product. And this is not an uncommon story to hear. So how did you guys fill in that kind of knowledge gap early on when you were building that prototype, to know that you were getting value for money, that you were getting something built that was going to work, that was effective? How did you kind of, cross that bridge?
I mean, I guess being salespeople at heart, James is a great salesperson. I've been in sales, and you learn that, I guess you learn how to sell, and it's easy to do business with yourself for a long period of time, like the guys you've just spoken about, and convince yourself that your product's not good enough, and, we'd better do this feature or that feature. I think James and I were sort of cavalier enough, is probably the wrong word, but we could go out and speak to people and have enough confidence that if they wanted something, or if it made sense, we could deliver it to them. And we were able to sort of balance that out. Look, the product's good enough. It's good enough for us to go and have a conversation. We know it solves a problem, but we know it's not totally complete. And we always just knew that we didn't want to go and spend money that we didn't have, raise too much money too early, all of those sort of things. So I think it was just a mindset that we, if we weren't the salespeople, if we were the product people, or we were the development side of the equation, technical founders, then we probably would have spent a lot longer. And there was a million things we could have done in that product early on. But I think we just knew we had to get moving, and we were kind of happy to sell ahead of potentially what we had.
Yeah. Many people that have sat in this seat have brought up the naivety word, which you did before yourself as well. And I think outside of the founder seat, it's got a negative connotation. But as a founder, often it's actually quite a helpful thing. You don't know what you don't know. So therefore, you just kind of blindly push on. Sure, you'll make mistakes, but it'll actually stop you from stopping on many times that you may well have done otherwise if you had the sense to kind of do it. Richard Dawkins said that be careful what you believe, because you're the easiest person to fool. And so selling yourself a dream, I quote Jeremy Moon, actually. I was just consuming that episode again, great conversation, icebreaker. And he said, well, the thing with founders is that you've got to be a great liar. The first lie you have to tell is to yourself that this is a great product or a great idea, that it's great to leave your job, or great to work 75 hours a week every single week for 3 years on this thing that's not producing you a cent. So there's many things that are kind of wrapped up inside that story that we have to tell ourselves early on in the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to that, I'm probably on the more conservative side. I think, and I've learned over the years, not to be, but James goes the other way. And so he was probably the guy that, there were moments where we probably could have packed up or convinced ourselves, I could have convinced us that maybe this was going to be too hard or, we'd missed the mark. And I think he has that in spades. And it really was a huge driving force back in the day that he could walk into a room and people could tell us 5 reasons why they didn't want to buy it. And he'd walk out with the credit card number and I'd walk out and go, what on earth just happened there? If
Yes.
that was me, I'd be in the car halfway home by now. And so he brings that sort of skill. He can put the blinkers on and particularly in those early days,
Yeah,
push
yeah.
through and not take on board, some of the feedback that I probably would have.
Mm. So you did a few fundraising rounds. Obviously, you ultimately ended up in Charlotte, North Carolina, but along the way, you started with getting proof in New Zealand. How many customers did you get before you did a fundraise? And
So we had about look, it was probably 20 to 30 customers before we raised external money.
was that
Um,
$100 a month customers, or were they a bit
uh,
more?
Geez, I'd have about that. Let's say so 100. We charged based on per vehicle pricing, so like seat pricing, but for assets. And so a bit of luck and something that we might talk about at some point is sort of starting a company in New Zealand and building it for New Zealand and then taking it overseas. We were very fortunate in that the early work that James had done in AdWords and getting ourselves sort of a bit more international exposure, and that call came in from Anheuser-Busch, started us on this journey of understanding what federal motor carrier safety compliance looked like in the US. And we started building a product and talking about our product in the language that resonated with that market. And so our first ever customer was based in the US, in Philadelphia. And they're a company called Walters Services, and they managed a whole bunch of portaloos. And they had a bunch of trucks moving them around. They met the criteria and they needed to do DVIR. And at the point that I left Whip Around, they were still a customer. So our first ever customer was in the US. And that really gave us the confidence that we had to kind of get to the US and push in. And so, of our first, there may have been sort of 1 or 2 customers, but certainly the vast majority, I'm saying 95+% of our customers were always in the US. Australia came into the equation a bit. There were some in New Zealand over time, but really, from day one, it really was into the US. And I think that really helped our investment story as well, certainly back in those days. And I think it still is an important thing in the New Zealand tech space is how can you get into those big markets? So for us to be able to showcase a map of America and say, well, here's our 20 customers that we have. Here's where they live. They're in 15 different states, probably across the US. That really helped that narrative at that point to get some money on board. And we took some seed funding on board, a couple of $100,000. And I think at that point, I quite enjoyed real estate and I was doing all right in it and I was earning reasonable money. And so I think I was trying to convince James that, well, look, there's no point both of us doing this. Why don't you quit your job and give this a go? And then I'll fold in a bit later if it's going to work. And that was probably that conservative, bent I talked about. But bringing on that money, the absolute bottom line of that was, you're both in this full time and, this is what we're going to focus on. And it wasn't enough money to provide any great deal of security. We took a 2 or 3 year lease on a property. And I think, we probably had enough money in the bank to pay for about 4 months worth of rent. And a very, very humbling salary for us both. But it gave us at least 24 hours a day to think and breathe and focus on what we were doing. And that was really the proper start line. We'd proven the concept. We'd proven people would pay us. We'd proven that it was a product that the US market really needed. And now we just had to go and kind of execute on that plan at scale.
Do you recall what your early salary was? The magic number that I say to people, by the way, is $5K a month is about the number as
Yeah,
a
I think
founder.
I mean, the other thing is we were sort of early 30s at this point. I had just had or just about to have my first child. So, we weren't able to live on Weet-Bix and live out of the back of a car or anything like that. So I think it was about 100 grand
Yeah,
was
okay.
the first salary.
Yeah.
And that was for a fair number of years.
Yes.
And so, I don't think I ever got paid more than probably 120 grand at Whip Around. We were always not paying ourselves. And so, but that was enough to just
to make ends meet, basically. Yeah, I get that, especially when you've got a young family.
Yeah.
I've seen instances as an investor where founders have turned up and they've got this line of salaries for founders on the P&L, and it's kind of 250K per person. And we're like, in which world do you think that this is a fundraising kind of conversation that's realistic? You've got to go back to 100, 120 is reasonable when you get to a more mature age. If you're in your 20s as a founder, you're probably going to get 5K a month as a roundabout, as a rough rule of thumb. Any more than that, and investors will look at you like you're taking the piss. What was that early? Punakaiki was one of your.
No, they came in at one of our latter rounds. I think they were in 2021.
Yeah.
So we had a couple of private guys come in, Noah Hickey and his father-in-law. They were our seed investors. And so that was really enough to sort of get us across that start line. And then from there, as I said, that was, probably 4 to 6 months worth of salaries and rent. And, we brought on 1 or 2 people at that point. We had a couple of near misses where, we had paying customers and the platform would go down. And the contract developer that we were using, I remember one instance where it was about 4 a.m. and I get a call and the whole platform's gone down. Everything's black. There's nothing there. And so we're like, okay, we better ring. I won't say his name. Again, he's relatively well known, although this is just a pretty common story.
It's an honest mistake.
Yeah. And so we're like, right, we better ring him and get this fixed. Well, he's camping somewhere well out of cell phone reception. And this is Saturday morning. So it's Friday in the US. So
you got a whole weekend.
We got a whole weekend.
Down.
Yeah. And we were lucky that we had another company, independent of them, doing some work, sort of DevOps work or something in there. And they had enough access to be able to just patch the minor fix that needed to be fixed. And so we were back online. But that was a very, tough lesson that, right, we don't actually have the keys to our own kingdom here. And we need to have somebody in the business who at least has total control and oversight over the platform. So those very, very early days, our first hire, I think, was a digital marketer. And then the second was an engineer.
A developer second, yeah. I mean, that speaks a lot to your intentions, right? Is the idea is that we're going to be marketing-led and sales-led from the outset rather than product-led. I'll circle back around to that in a second. So you did some seed funding, you then got some VC kind of money over time. When we do those things for the first time, we're learning, back to that naivety thing, there's a lot of things that we just don't know. Were there any mistakes that you made in hindsight in those early fundraising motions?
I don't think so. Later in the conversation, I'm sure we'll sort of talk about control and, the structure of the company and the board and things, which have been, big learning points for me. We predominantly raised private money. And so by the cap table, when we just exited, had about 119 shareholders on it. And of that, there were only really 2 institutional shareholders, being Punakaiki and another one out of the US called Amplo. And even they were, they only took ordinary shares. They didn't have board seats. They had no overt control. They participated in a round alongside all of our other investors. So we had a very flat cap table. And, there was very little influence from our shareholder base. And so in those early days, I think that did play to our advantage because we were sort of confident in what we were doing. We didn't have too many people trying to push us around or tell us what to do. So long as we were delivering, a reasonable growth number and we were doing what we said we were going to do, everyone was happy with a quarterly investor report. And, it was pretty smooth sailing. So I think looking back and to answer your question, did we make any mistakes? We did have enough experience in the room from people that had been through different capital raising processes. And we had a CFO who had, again, another ex-Pushpay guy, Puhan. So I think we had enough experience in the room to get through those initial phases, and that set the platform for what we did in the future. Um, the base was there that we could just build on, and when we needed to raise more money, we could tap our existing investors, who by and large were pretty supportive. And then we went again for a pretty big round in 2021.
Yep. Which we'll come to. So Noah was the seed money. Then Noah came on board as an employee and the CEO, which he was for a number of years.
Yeah, so Noah and I mean, I was the CEO for a number of years. Then Noah and I were co-CEOs, which was the thing to do back in the day.
This is probably about around COVID time, just pre.
Yeah,
Yeah.
about
I
then.
did the same thing with Ambit for a period
Yep.
of time.
And then
How did it work out for you guys? It was disastrous for us.
yeah, look, I think the co-CEO role actually worked for us. We sort of had quite complementary skill sets, and I think that worked. And then for whatever reason, we raised a bunch of money in 2021, and sort of around that time, the board decided that we should have one CEO, and that ended up being Noah. So that's how the business sort of continued from about 2021.
Hmm. You talked about some kind of foundational decisions that then play out over time. So what were the things that you perhaps in hindsight would have changed about some of those earlier kind of motions of, control and shareholder status and influence and that sort of thing?
I think, and this is a personal opinion, obviously, but later in the journey, and certainly over the last couple of years, there was a lot of tension around the direction of the company, around the strategy, around some of the decisions that were being made, and I certainly felt that that was a time where I would have quite liked to have a significant shareholder at the board. Someone who was an expert in the type of business that we ran. We could say a VC in inverted commas, but somebody who was exposed to the SaaS industry and tech, more so than the industry we operated in. I don't think we had an issue necessarily understanding the fleet compliance and fleet maintenance side of things, but as some of these issues, were sort of coming to the table, I think that's where I looked back to some of those early days and thought, would we be better off having somebody at this board table or somebody involved in this business who had an opinion that we could sort of rely on to, find some common ground. Having 119 shareholders, all who were, rats and mice effectively, meant that all of those discussions happened in a very tight group. And I think that's where some of the control dynamics over the years caused a lot of friction. People, as people do, have different opinions, and we just didn't really have that independent intermediary there that I would have liked to provide a sounding board that we could all rely upon.
Yeah. When with the board work that I do, which is not the majority of the things that I do professionally, I find them a little too distant from the customer and kind of the actual business as well. So only in isolated instances will I take those opportunities on when I'm essentially working directly with the founder rather than external shareholders. But one of the things that I do is either in that situation or when consulting to people to how to get these things to work properly, is that I'm quite clear about setting up a board charter at the outset, which is a constitution of the board. Obviously, you do the skills matrix. That's a pretty well-trodden path, which is, where are we going? What are the skills that we need to be able to see our way into that future that will give people the ability to talk from an experience base rather than opinion base, which are two quite different things. And then the important piece is how do we roll as a group? So how do we communicate with each other? How do we resolve problems? How do we review and get feedback as a mechanism in place? Like, for example, I have a rhythm that I go through, which is to rate the meeting when we've finished the board meeting out of 10, no sevens. And then say, what is it that you could do to improve? And what is it that we could do to improve afterwards? And everyone has to say something afterwards. First couple of times you do it, it's a bit uncomfortable in New Zealand because we don't talk like this ordinarily, especially you get to a certain demographic, baby boomers particularly, like they won't talk about anything with each other, let alone our performance and our behaviour. But that's one of the things that I do. You've mentioned having a different constitution on the board. How have those influenced how you've gone about setting up your business that you're involved in now, which we'll talk to later on? But yeah, how have they influenced your thinking around?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah,
I think, I'll cut to the end of the journey and we'll come back from there. But, I ended up off the board at the end of this, not only out of the business, but also got voted off the board at an AGM. And so, um, there was a period of time where we had different rights and things as founders, and I guess, in a little bit of blind faith, let some of those wash away over the years. And so that enabled those scenarios to play out. That sort of enabled, me to be sitting off the board at the very final finish line of this journey. And so carrying that into the ventures that I'm involved in now, and not just for things in my own interests, but certainly things that I talk to other founders about where I'm advising, or just friends getting into business, is really map out as far as you can. You can't crystal ball, but what does some of those dynamics in the business look like? What are what are the decisions that are made by shareholders? What are the decisions made by the board? If you were to sort of lick your finger and stick it in the air and say, we're going to raise some money and we're going to dilute in these sort of tranches, and when do you lose control of certain mechanisms within the business? Do you put an appointment right for yourself in the shareholders agreement, so that so long as you own one share or 5% of the company or whatever it is, you have a right to be on the board or appoint someone to the board? So it's just, these are the things I think that certainly first-time founders, but a lot of businesses that just haven't been through the nitty-gritty of robust, differences of opinion. They haven't had to refer on these things. They haven't had to lean on them, and they haven't understood what the implications of some of these things are. And so just mapping all of that out. I mean, the saying, negotiate your divorce on your wedding day, wrongly, I probably hang on to, but it is that. It is when everyone's happy and motivated by going into business with one another, and everyone's, views of the world are aligned. That's the time to sit down and go, okay, particularly as founders, because, life changes. And if you go in 50-50, and James and I did at the very start of this business, and fortunately, we were both committed to it and for the long term, and it all worked. But what happens if one of the founders has a change of circumstance and they have a child and they need to go and get a day job? And this happens so often, and then they own 50% of the company and only one founder's working in it. And there's this unfair, imbalance of equity, and all of those things can be dealt with up front, and they can be very fair, but it's always contribution and it's always money, generally, that unravel these relationships. And so that's the advice that I give. I'm not a lawyer, and I sort of provide this advice more from the hard lessons learned than anything. But those are the things I always say. Look, project this forward as far as you can. Protect yourself. Protect, the relationships, because if everyone knows what the expectations are, then the personal relationships don't have to break down around it. It's when there's that ambiguity that people start, and then it plays into your mental health, because you lie awake at night and, 95% of the concerns that you have about the world or what people are doing or thinking, they're just your own thoughts. And that's that's the downward slope in business, really, is when you start having a relationship breakdown with the people that, you really so importantly at that phase need to be so aligned with and have a mutual confidence in.
Yeah. I'm just going to unpack a point that you made there, because I think this is a super, super valid thing to get right and to reconsider. Contribution, so making sure that you're aware of the time and the resources that you bring to the business. Is that what you mean?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in the absolute blunt senses, are you in the business or are you not? Are you the founder that's left to go and work back at the bank again because you've had a kid? Or, there are, and this is another nuance in some of these scenarios, where work and contribution does come in sort of fits and starts in those early stages. And to your original point, where you've got a technical founder, and then you've got a sales founder, and then you've got a product guy, or whatever the mix might be. Well, the sales guy might not have as much ability to go out and do a whole bunch of the selling day one, because the dev team's building a product. And then, so you've got to map that out. And then all of a sudden there's a product to sell, and the sales guy's running around like a headless chicken trying to sell. And the dev team's going, all right, well, tell us what we've got to build here. What are we prioritizing? What's the feedback? And they're not doing as much. And so, eyes wide open that business isn't completely linear, particularly when you're building a product and selling it, and it's sort of ebbs and flows. But having that understanding and sort of, making at least an acknowledgement, I think, I love memorandums of understanding,
Yeah.
because they're not with the paper they're written on,
Yeah.
but they at least document what your intention was at the start
And
of
you've had the
something.
conversation, right?
And all of a sudden, in the heat of an argument, and geez, James and I had some great arguments, but that if we had have said, hey, look, this is what we agreed, and this is what we discussed even 3 months ago, then you sort of have a bit of evidence to go, okay, well, maybe that was, and maybe we're overthinking this. And so I just think the more you can do in that space doesn't have to slow you down, but it's just when you're in a good point, look ahead, document it. And then everyone sort of saves themselves the angst of, and there is always something. There will always be. I don't know of one business that I've ever had any sort of insight in where it's been smooth sailing the whole time,
I agree. And then having the ability to have what you referred to there, which is a super insightful thing that you said, a great argument. Right, and a great argument means that it was an argument, which is never pleasant in the moment, but it was productive, right? Because you can both get a point across, and you can work out some sort of decision afterwards. Then you've got the alternative, which is a shitty argument, where people descend into blaming, name calling, that kind of thing, which is a non-productive kind of conversation. I'll circle back around to this contribution thing, because there's some things that I think that people need to consider when they're at the point of having these discussions. And there's no easy answer. It's just what's right for you guys. So there's two things that I think you're trying to solve for. The first is that what skills are you providing to the company, and what's the market worth of those skills, and do you care about that? So for example, if you have the situation of a product, a sales, and a technical co-founder, then at the right level in the right organization, they're going to carry a similar kind of number. But if you've got one of those people that is markedly differently skilled on the way in the door, then a super top-notch enterprise sales guy could be walking away from a 400K job, right? That's real right now, right? And has been for 10 years, right? Whereas if you're a competent software engineer, you might be walking away from a 150K job. And so do you account for that delta at the outset? There's a $250,000 difference. What I've seen some people do is to have a shareholder's current account. And so you're kind of going, I'm sacrificing this out in the real world, so therefore some money will go into my shareholder's current account, and we can deal with that down the path. That's a mechanism. Another mechanism is that I have more options that are available to me. We start at the same point, but my vesting is greater than yours because my sacrifice is greater than yours out in the market. Neither of those is right nor wrong. They're just different mechanisms. Another is to go, well, we're all this together, so we're all going to be paid the same, and we're going to get distributed the same amount of options along the way. We're going to be distributed our vesting into our own equity along the way at the same amount. So none of those are right nor wrong. Any view on those things?
I think the whole current account approach is very sophisticated, and I think maybe for sort of second or third time founders, people that have probably been there and have learned some of these lessons, I think that's a very apt way to deal with it, and very mature. In saying that, I think there's something kind of romantic about being, equal shareholders in something, and yep, you bring a skill, but that's why you're there, and they bring a skill. That's sort of that should be where the genesis sits for me. And I think, unless there's money involved and people are bringing in different equity, or it's someone else's idea and they've brought it in, and there's an imbalance there. But if you're genuinely starting something together, I think starting from a level playing field is the right way to do it, because whether or not, you're earning different money out in the real world, I think if you've got less vested interest in something, it will manifest itself somehow. It will probably enhance the chances of a disagreement, or, the expectations become a little bit misaligned. I think that then when you get to a point is the role that a good board plays, and that level of independence, and getting your head around the role of a board. A lot of people struggle with that. They're in management, they're running their own business. Even if it's just them at a board, you need to put a different hat on. You need to sit there and address different issues that are not you in your day job, and are not, the things that you deal with in every weekly meeting. They are solvency, they are governance, they are health and safety. They are, okay, I'm putting my hat on as Tim, the director, and we're a year into this and the business has now turned into a proper thing. Well, Josh, you're actually, if we went to market and looked at what you could get paid in a similar company, it's more than you're getting paid now. And we'll take into consideration your equity and whatever. And well, Tim, you're only worth so-and-so because, you're a developer and whatever. That's where I think the maturity of the business has to get to, but I just don't think it's day one.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard at day one to have that visibility, and there is that romantic notion of we're all in this together as well. In non-tech businesses where the multiple is a much better trodden path, and there's a bell-shaped curve that tends to apply to everything. And if you're in the restaurant services industry, food services industry, then you're going to get 4.5 times multiple for a good business. There's going to be this thing called a normalizing of salaries. And so if you've overpaid yourself as the founder of the company for the general manager role of the company, then that should be reflected back into the P&L, and there'll be some money added to the value of the company, because you've more than likely than not, though, you've underpaid yourself. And so this is a risk that a lot of people are not aware of when it comes to exit time, is that if you've got, let's say, 3 shareholders and they've been paying themselves $150K less than what their replacement cost would be each, then that's $450,000 that's going to flow back in a negative way into the P&L, because that's what the business is going to cost to run, which is another way to think about it, non-tech businesses. You mentioned directorships, being on the board, and the experience that you had, which is a shitty experience. Can I ask for you, as the co-founder of the company, what that was like? What was that like to be voted off the board?
I wouldn't go as far as saying a shitty experience. I think, to drill that down, is it didn't go as planned. And I think I learned a lot of lessons the hard way through the course of that journey. And, the sort of final piece of that was sort of the shock, departure from the board at an AGM, and there's no discussion. It went to a vote, and it was just that's not how I like to operate as a director. And I certainly wouldn't again. You've got to find consensus. You've got to communicate. And I think that was the dark side of my experience. And you'd probably get a very different story from other people. But, we ended up in a place where that was enabled to happen. I didn't have a right to be there. I was up for rotation. So it was all very much above board from a legal, shareholders, governance kind of process perspective. There was nothing wrong with that. I mean, it was probably that we were probably too far down that rabbit hole of corporate governance, mechanics that, I woke up one morning and by that afternoon I wasn't even a director on the company I'd started. And that just really came down to, power, control, majority, and ultimately a difference in opinion. And so, I genuinely have walked away from Whip Around. I'm only 41, and I think I've probably learnt, a lot more lessons the hard way than some people do, in a far longer time. And, I've got a fair bit of time left in me to kind of put those to use, to help other people, to feed them into the businesses that, I'm starting again or I'm involved with. So I am genuinely, happy is probably not the right word, but I appreciate the experience.
At peace with it?
Yeah, I'm at peace with it.
Mm.
Because I think the benefit to me is actually the learning that I've got. I mean, it was the greatest education I've had. And to, the credit of the board that was there, there was a lot of positives. I learned a lot about, learned a lot about what governance was. I learned what I agreed with. I learned what I didn't agree with. But fundamentally, there was a huge learning curve in that for me. And a lot of that actually, was hugely beneficial. And I appreciate, I genuinely do appreciate what I've taken away from Whip Around in that sense. It's just, the final throes of it, didn't land on my side of the court. And for that, it was just a pretty disappointing end to, would have been a pretty amazing, exciting journey, from start to finish.
Yeah, yeah. Had you ceased your employment with the business at that stage as well?
Yep.
Okay.
And that was quite important. The reason the I totally agree that no matter who you are, founder, non-founder, the newest employee, the oldest employee, people can make decisions about your employment. And that is the role of, whether it's the board making those decisions or whether it's the CEO or whoever it might be. I don't lose sleep over not being employed in there because ultimately that wasn't my decision. And that there you could look at that in all sorts of different ways. But being able to step out of the business and focus solely on the governance of it and the strategy of it and being able to apply what I knew about the business and the industry and all of those sort of things in a very objective way was, I think, a really exciting opportunity. And we, I did that for, probably a year or a year and a half. And so to be able to lose my seat at the board, which I thought was contributing a lot of value, was just a bit gutting, not just for me personally. It wasn't an ego thing at all. It was just, I knew that the value that I could bring to the business was not being appreciated. And my view of why I ended up on the outer of it, was probably, I think there were interests that were slightly misaligned. So that's business, that's life. And to walk away and be able to understand how we got to that point and some of the things that I probably let slide that I wouldn't again, you can only take as the learning curve that you can only learn in practice. It's not a textbook. It's not a YouTube video usually. It's learning it the hard way.
Yeah. One of the things that I go looking for when I'm either my scholarship program, when I'm employing people for my own business, and key roles for the organizations that I'm involved in on the board, and we're appointing a CEO, for example, the most important determinant of success is resilience. It's a well-trodden path now. Carol Dweck, in her book Grit, kind of outlays that. And so the thing with resilience is that you can't watch a YouTube video or watch Touching the Void. Have you seen that movie about the mountaineers that get stuck in the Patagonia?
I've heard about it.
Oh, it's the most unbelievable story. I'd thoroughly recommend anyone to watch it, Touching the Void. It's gritty. It's hard to watch what these guys went through, but I won't do any spoilers on there, but it's unbelievable. You have to be on the field, having the climb, getting fired from the board, whatever it might be, to have that experience, because you've got to have that hardship to build the resilience. You can't read about it. And so, the person that you are today is the sum total of the experiences and the consequences of the decisions that you've made over time, right, to get to this point.
Yeah,
totally. A question about that for you is that I think about founders as being, sometimes they are natural entrepreneurs. So the entrepreneur is the person who's always looking for the spark of something, the problem that can be solved, the next great idea, the build thing. Other people are kind of accidental entrepreneurs in that they had a problem that they were just intimately connected with for years and years and years, and they really wanted to get a solution to that thing. Others are put into a circumstance whereby they kind of needed to do something, and the best thing for them to do in that situation was to go and start a business. And the folk that are the natural or the always-on entrepreneurs, they can often struggle in that board kind of environment because it's compliance and it's process and it's governance. And that's the reason I don't seek out a lot of those roles, because it's not my nature, right? I'm much more the entrepreneurial kind of person. And that's reflected in the businesses that I've started as either a sole founder or as a co-founder. And I look for my successor because I know I get to about 10 million bucks of revenue, give or take. I don't want to be running this thing anymore. There's too many moving parts. There's too much internal facing. There's too much building of systems and processes. I can do that stuff, but it doesn't light my fire. Are you that person as well? Because you've gone and started another business now. And so do you know intimately which of those characters
I mean, look, I love, it just seems odd saying it out loud, but I do love governance. I appreciate it. And I do enjoy the process of what a good board can do. And I'm big on that earlier than most people probably want to, and in other businesses that I'm involved in, is just get the cadence going, have a board meeting. Let's just put a simple agenda together of things that we're not going to deal with in the day to day. And so just separating out those duties, I think, is important. So I am very much, not to answer your question about the sort of entrepreneurial genesis of things, but I do like a board, and I probably am less, day to day. I'm far more strategic than I am tactical, I think. But I'm happy to roll my sleeves up. You've got to get from 0 to 1 before you can replace yourself or afford to do anything other than you being the guy that's picking up the phone and sending emails. And so I'm happy at the early stages, but yeah, I think if it was a perfect world, I'm far more strategic and high level than I am probably in the weeds and operational. Um, and I think I've never really been gainfully employed. As a commercial real estate agent, commission only for 11 years. That was really my first proper job, other than a few hack around jobs, at university and things. But I think that just sort of molds you into someone who you eat what you kill. That's the way you operate. If you don't work hard, well, you're not going to eat. You're not going to earn any money. No one fronts up and knocks on the door of your agency and says, "Hey, here's my listing. Here's some free money."
I've got a favorite Chinese proverb, which is man stand with mouth open for a long time, waiting for roast duck to fly in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. And so I think, and I look back on my real estate career as probably being more formative than I ever gave it credit for, because you've got to hustle.
Yeah.
You got to pick up the phone. You've got to network. You got to do a good job. Otherwise, you spend a lot of time finding new clients over and over again. And you've always got to, hunt. You got to, make your own way in the world. And if you do that well and you work hard and you're smart about it, you can earn bloody good money. And so applying that thinking to business, not to say that real estate agents aren't business people, because I think there's a lot of things you've got to consider these days in that world that, probably is like running a business. But to bring that into the business world is, well, no one's going to do this for us. I could not get up in the morning or not do this or not make that last phone call of the day or whatever it is, not take the risk, not borrow the money from the bank, but you're never going to win. And so I think I've been fortunate that, I never intended to be a real estate agent, but it was probably the greatest introduction to professional life that I could have got, because I do believe that if you get stuck in the corporate world, very hard to get out. It's a lot harder, my friends and people that I've involved with that are having to leave the safety of a corporate job to go and take the risk, particularly as you get older. It's all right if you're in your 20s and you can eat noodles for dinner for 12 months, but the world works against you. It is designed for you not to go and become an entrepreneur. And so I think I was lucky that I already had that appetite for risk. I wasn't really, I was walking away from good, earnings and commission.
Yes.
But I was never comfortable. I was never, it was just, I had to go hunt somewhere else and make that work. So I was probably fortunate in that sense.
Yeah. So jumping back to Whip Around and a couple of key moments that we haven't talked about, the company was flipped in totality to the States. Is that right? You've kept some employees in New Zealand?
No, so it was up until it was acquired recently. It was still a New Zealand company. And really we sort of intentionally, I would say, to the most part, we continued to build our product and engineering function in New Zealand. We had our, the company was a New Zealand company. It was registered here. Most of our investors were New Zealanders, but our market certainly was in the US. And so our sales and customer success teams were based in North Carolina, largely.
Why North Carolina?
Get asked that all the time. So, and it ended up being another one of those sort of lucky inflection points, I think. When we decided we needed to get some boots on the ground, James and I were, 2:00 in the morning, we'd rock up to our office in Ponsonby Road and start cold calling American trucking companies. We had this list of everyone that was registered with the Department of Transportation, million trucking companies on this. It's publicly available, good old America.
Wow.
But of this list, it just had one contact, and it was sort of the contact of the person who was responsible for their compliance. Now, of that list, 40% were probably dead. The other 40% no longer worked there.
Yeah.
So of that, there might have been, 100,000 on this list who actually existed, who may answer the phone. But
Still a big TAM, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so we were calling. We were literally picking up the phone and cold calling. in a cold office at 2 o'clock in the morning with a New Zealand accent. And as you can imagine, that was not hugely successful. At one point, we actually had to get this YouTube video of office noises playing in the background because it was deathly silent. And so at least we had a photocopier whirring and a coffee cup clinging, and just to give us some humanity when we were doing this. But that didn't really work either. And so we knew that we sort of, we had such a short runway at that point that it was like, right, if we're going to raise any more money, the board said we needed to get to 100 customers, whatever it was. It was very, very early on. And so we said to James, well, you've got to get on a plane. You've got our HubSpot pipeline of people that we've engaged with. Go and hunt them down. And anyway, sure enough, came back 3 weeks later and he'd got the balance of the customers that we'd needed. And so we sort of got some follow-on funding and moved on from there. But that really just showed that being there, even as a New Zealander, and we're talking, some pretty middle American trucking companies and waste companies and things, just the ability to go and see them in their time zone and build that trust that, you'd often lack from just being on the other end of a phone, we could get a hell of a lot more done. And so we sort of accelerated our plans to build a team in America. We went looking for people that were sort of appropriate for the role, people that were in the industry, weren't in the industry. And we ended up getting a conversation with a guy called Mike Flournoy, who is still at Whiparound now as our VP of sales. And he was a sales leader at a large telematics company. They used to be called Fleetmatics. They'd been bought by Verizon. And so he knew the industry. He'd spent the last however many years selling tech into fleet managers. He was a sales leader. And so he had bench strength. He had people, I know that, there's a handful of people that would probably come with me. He knew what DVIR was. And he was a really good guy. And so we thought, okay, well, this is our guy, clearly. And he was going to bring another couple of guys with him. And he just happened to be in Charlotte, North Carolina. Okay. So that's sort of how we ended up there. But in retrospect, it was the greatest decision because other than having to fly there every month, it's a hell of a lot more onerous than, heading to LA or West Coast. Charlotte's a great city, great part of the States, very up and coming. So you're not paying, the high costs of living or rent or employment or anything like that, in New York or Los Angeles or San Fran. But you've got a massive growing talent pool. A lot of people are leaving those expensive areas to move into the Carolinas, beautiful part of the States. And so we just found this really awesome home. It's got enough Southern charm that the people are awesome. And, we've built lifelong friendships with people that, have ultimately been part of that journey with us. And so Charlotte, North Carolina just became a part of the Whiparound story.
Yeah, great.
We had this great dynamic where we had a really, really cool culture. And I don't just say that because, it was the company I started. It certainly was led by people, more so other than me over the years. But we had this very introverted, quiet sort of New Zealand, very multicultural New Zealand team, who were our developers, our product people, our finance team. And so they were, Kiwis here, but, they'd come from all over. We had, plenty of Eastern Europeans and Indians and, all sorts of different cultures that were this great melting pot at Whiparound at Auckland. But it was very introverted. And then we had this outgoing, sort of gregarious, awesome culture in Charlotte with our sales team and our customer success team and this, awesome sort of Southern charm that when you brought those together, created this really unique sort of blend that Whiparound became. And so it ended up being really cool. A really cool sort of part of the whole journey was, one day leaving the office in Auckland, and then the next morning I'd be walking into North Carolina, into the office up there, and I sort of would have to pinch myself and think,
I reckon 2026 is perhaps the most important year of the new millennium. This is powered through artificial intelligence. There's a tectonic shift going on in business right now, and I think you have an opportunity to capitalize on it. I've written a white paper. It's available on my website, joshcomrie.com, under the resources section, completely free of charge, and it'll give you some thinking and some resources and some how-tos in this rapidly changing world. Enjoy.
How lucky am I that I'm getting to do this? And, I just genuinely was always just sort of dumbstruck by how did I end up here? How did I end up in this meeting room in St. Louis, Missouri, or, all these little moments. And I think that's just one of the magics of starting a business and enabling yourself to, go international and end up in weird places and meet strange people. And, that's something you can't really put a price on.
Yeah, I think that's an understated benefit, actually, is the life experiences that you get along the way. People often talk about the opportunities they can give other people as well as being one of the great benefits of being a founder of a company. But the things that you get to take away, like the crazy moments, the near-death moments, the growth moments, the people moments that you get, are often these really unspoken benefits about things. So really good to point out. So at what stage on the journey, let's talk about a couple of growth and scale moments. How long into the business did it take to get to about $1 million of recurring revenue?
Um,
And then 10 as well, because I think you got into the
yeah,
eight figures, right? So,
we were probably at $1 million in year 3.
okay, that's fast growth, especially with
Yep.
a product that is, you're billing by the vehicle, so you're probably getting away from the $100 per customer a month and into the
We
thousands.
always had for the entirety of the whip around, we always had an increase in our average revenue per customer. And we were pretty smart on that. I think we learned pretty early on that, SaaS is an art form and there's different ways to sell that ship. And, you've got to really focus on CAC, but, you've also got different ways to grow revenue. And I think NRR, net revenue retention, was probably our greatest asset. And, we weren't always just out putting prices up. That's a pretty blunt instrument, and particularly when you're in an increasingly competitive environment. So we were rolling out new features. We were really smart with what we were gating. We were doing a whole lot of things. And so, we were sort of getting up, probably closer to 400 or something like that. So the revenue curve was working in our favor. We were getting much larger fleet sizes, as well as charging more for our product for different features and things. We probably hit 10 million in 2021,
Okay,
something like that.
so that was about another 4 years later?
That was probably year 5.
Year 5?
Yep.
Okay, well, so 1 to 10 in about 2 years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, it's
Something like that.
phenomenal
Yeah.
growth.
So yeah, and then, the rest is sort of probably confidential in terms of where we got to, but, certainly getting over that 10 is a big milestone, because we found, as we were looking at different investment in the US, you get a lot of approaches. As you well know, Josh, the market, the VC market and the private equity market is so massive. And as soon as you're on the radar, they're all ringing, they're all wanting meetings, and you learn very quickly that they want to know one thing: what's your revenue? And unless you're at 10, they're not really that interested. It's not worth their time and energy. So getting across that milestone was a big thing, because we we were sort of playing in the big leagues at that point, and you can have much more robust conversations. And when people do approach you and ask you that question, you can say, yeah, well, we're north of that.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they sort of, want to talk turkey. So it was good. Yeah, look, the growth was good. No doubt we were operating in an environment where the tailwinds of SaaS were certainly in our favor. I think it's obviously now you just need to read the headlines, but we were operating in in an environment at the crosshairs of a couple of really interesting things. So one, SaaS was great. B, we were operating in the US, which has had huge scale. Third, we were operating in an environment that had a regulatory backdrop. So, the term reg tech gets thrown around. I don't think we were quite there, but we certainly played into that narrative. And, America is a incredibly large, modern country, but there's lanes of it that are very behind. And the transportation sector was one of them.
Right. Finance and transportation
Yeah.
are famously the two most stuck in the dark ages.
Exactly. Banking in the US is the most painful thing.
Yeah. Checks. They still write checks.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
Well, internet banking, the last time I tried to do it, one bank would cut a check and send it to your bank, and that was the digital bank transfer. So the sort of backdrop of that being able to digitize a paper process, have a conversation where there was federal regulations and significant penalties if they were not doing this properly. The regulations really for us meant that it was impossible to comply with. If you were a multi-state operator, the way the regulations were actually sort of worded and your obligations within them, you couldn't meet them if you were operating the traditional paper process that, there's a company in the US called J.J. Keller, and they were like the market leader of paper inspection books. Well, that fundamentally really couldn't, you'd have to have a registered sort of address. And if that address didn't have all the filings of those particular maintenance records, then you were non-compliant. You could get audited at any point. But obviously, if you're 700 miles away in a different state and those trucks operated there, well, how on earth are you, so there were all these little things that helped us. And I think that once we got on a real heater with our sales team, and look, it was expensive because we built a traditional inside sales team. We would have had 30 salespeople probably at one point between, BDRs, like good, awesome smiler and dialers, and then AEs who were actually sitting demos and closing deals. And the guys that we had, Mike, who I talked about, Pete, who's still there, Jake Ciccarelli, who's gone on to start another business I've been helping with called Truthfully. These guys were just experts in, they had this sort of sales methodology. They were scripted. I mean, our sales script could change 3 times in a day.
Wow.
Because we'd figure out what the hook was, what was getting the calls, what lists were working. And at one point you'd be sending out emails. This is sort of before GDPR probably. And we were calling clicks and opens. If someone clicked and we were getting that feedback, that was a hot lead.
Yes.
There was a warm body.
Right.
Actually, there might have been a warm body. It may have been an email spam filter opening that email. But
Yes.
And then if someone had just opened it, then, there was also probably a warm body there. So, we were calling anything that may have had a pulse
Yes.
at any point. And our team was awesome. The culture was sensational. But it was expensive, but we were getting, again, good old SaaS. You bring in the revenue, you invest in it, you keep your CAC at a certain level, and your value is going to, pay you back on that. And that model was working. It was working right up, into, COVID was obviously a bit of a hiccup. But even through that, COVID sort of helped us because we had, the physical nature of work changed. And so digitizing something where you had to be, the alternative was you had to be in a room, you had to interact, it was face to face, it was handing paper, it was doing things that people didn't really want to do anymore. So digitizing that, and we were able to build some functionality in the platform that sort of spoke to the COVID kind of health thing a little bit for drivers. So yeah, that enabled that growth.
Yeah.
We really did sort of put the fuel on the fire post 2021.
You make some decisions to capitalize on the timing opportunity that's around you. And the thing that is sitting underneath the read tech thing, not quite, but close to that, is the notion of, are you selling a vitamin or a painkiller? And you were selling a painkiller, and that'll win all day, every day, right? Because you need this thing because it's going to resolve something which is quite pronounced inside your business. Is it true that you had a bit of a run of the market? Did you have a natural competitor at some point?
Yeah, we did. We
Right.
had an increasing amount of competitors over the years, and it sort of worked in a couple of different ways. So where we found our strongest lane, like we did very well selling directly B2B, but that did get a little bit harder, just as, America's a great sort of place to sell because they're very commercial. They'll give you a credit card over the phone if you're going to provide them value. They will buy.
Wow.
Whereas I find New Zealand's a little bit slow on that. You need to go for 9 coffees and come back 4 weeks later and they'll think about it. Americans will buy, but you got to break through. They're sold to every day, everywhere, auto dialers on the phone. And so if we could get the breakthrough, then the conversation was quite powerful. Our conversion rate was really good and we had a valuable product. And the painkiller sort of aspect of that definitely helped us. But our competitive landscape, we had telematics had the run on the industry. They'd sort of been forced to move into this sort of digitized hours of service law where, everyone was fudging their driver logbooks for the number of hours they were driving, or they'd run 2 logbooks, or, all sorts of tricks. So the industry said, right, well, if you meet this criteria, you have to have what's called an ELD, an electronic logging device. And that was, for a lot of companies, that was the first piece of tech they had to adopt. And so ELD washed through the industry just as we were starting out life in sort of 2018, 2017. And so it was great because, they were sort of focused on that, but it was, okay, technology, what is it? How do we adopt it? How is change management perceived in the industry? And then what happened is the people that were doing all the ELD technology were actually the people that had tried to sell, well, had done very well selling GPS tracking. So, just simple, where's your fleet, a little bit of route optimization off the back of that. They then got into electronic logging devices. And then that platform was set for telematics. So you had, the big companies that have done very well from that: Verizon Connect, Motive, Samsara, Geotab. And they were selling, that more expensive hardware, but it monitored everything from location to route optimization to vehicle sensor data, driver performance, harsh braking, speed breaches, a whole suite of different things that was important to the industry. And so we had a deliberate strategy that we were going to partner with a lot of these guys, because as much as they were competitors and they had said, hey, we can do a DVIR, we've got a maintenance, feature set you can have, it was never their priority. And so we just became sort of more of an inch wide, mile deep, focused solution, domain expert in fleet maintenance, particularly when it came to the compliance layer of that. So we actually found a lot more partnership opportunities in those telematics companies than competitors, and some went better than others. But outside of that, there were also other whip-arounds. There's a company called Fleetio, which has gone on and done very well, and there's a few other non-fleet specific ones that sort of came into our space, that big MaintainX and a few others. So there was always a competitive environment. Fleetio was probably the one we came across the most. But that was, I think competition's a healthy thing, reinforces that you're in the right market.
Totally. And people also, you share the load of developing that market as well. There's more people out there selling and kind of raising awareness that there's a product that can alleviate this need. It's really interesting. In the mid-90s, I spent some time on a bus in Europe, and we're talking about technology evolution and adoption here. And at that stage, they were already using digital tracking of vehicles. They called it a tacho. But it was this device that was like, I would make it similar to like a seismometer. So it was this thing that kind of etched onto a bit of paper. It was the very early days of digital tracking, and it would be time, speed, and distance all tracked on this bit of paper. And so rather than a logbook, because that famous story of 2 logbooks, because it's down to human intervention, Australia, New Zealand, the States, super famous, right? Everyone knew there was 2 logbooks. There's the one for the company that you get paid on. There's the one for the regulator. And so Europe got around this, 25 years before the States did. The States love to tell stories about how technologically advanced they are. We just acknowledge that transportation and finance are like literally in the dark ages, like, almost back in the days of barter. And so the story is not always their reality. I'll shift gears slightly and let's start talking about the exit itself. So at what stage did that conversation start coming up inside the business that, hey, you've got something, I know it wasn't a complete exit of the shares, but rather a strategic investment that came on board. But at what stage did that conversation start to come up?
It came in different layers, I guess. As I was out of the business as part of that exit, I made it pretty clear that I wanted to take some money off the table. I had other things I wanted to do. And if I was going to be outside of whip-around, then, that was the right time for me to kind of move on. So the conversation was sort of on the table then from my perspective. James largely felt the same way.
Was he in or out at that stage?
He was in. He sort of followed me fairly closely out the door. And so, there was a bit of pressure from us, I guess, to the business to say, look, why don't we work on finding someone to replace us who can, bring some capital, some fresh perspective, new ideas, and, give some energy to the business that might have been sort of being sapped by, some of the the sort of differences of opinion. That wasn't a straightforward process. There seemed to be a bit of an agenda that didn't want to support that from the board level for James and I. So that sort of ended up being a little bit of a, death by 1,000 cuts from my personal thing. I was having to go out and try and, sell secondaries and do things like that. And I was fortunate that there were investors who still, took a long-term view and whip around and were happy to, albeit having to take a haircut on the share price. There were investors like Punakaiki who had been really good, and Lance and I have a great reputation because great relationship because he was pretty supportive, and I think is one of those investors who understands that process, that there is a path for founders out of a business. It doesn't have to be the finish line for everybody. And so the exit conversation was certainly sort of on the table at that point, because there was James and I, and I know there were other shareholders that had been in for a long time and were looking for liquidity for their own reasons. And so I guess the board had to start that conversation and figure out what that path looked like, what the business needed to look like, what was important in the market at that time. We were just at a bit of an inflection point in that SaaS layer of growth at all costs was coming off. Huge burn rates were not there, and we'd done a good job at arresting a lot of that. We'd certainly done it. We'd put a lot of fuel on the fire, but we'd also seen that that wasn't going to be the long-term net value gain for us. So, balancing out growth, profitability, all of those things was sort of where the discussion ended up. What is going to give us total, shareholder value maximization, really? And, pair that with, a handful of shareholders, certainly James and I, wanting to probably, round out our time there because we were no longer in the business, no longer on the board. Our time had come. And so that was about the time when, I guess we stepped out of the conversation. And so I can't talk to too much of how, what happened from there until the moment that, we had to plug back in as key shareholders and sort of talk about this deal structure, what that looked like, and what was needed to be done for AKKR to kind of acquire the company effectively. And so, that was 10 years more to go, I guess.
That, by the way, in New Zealand, so in the Valley, it's 7 years is the average time from inception, registration of company to exit. That number's, it dropped down to 5 over the frothy deal period of 21-22, but it's crept back up to 7 again, which is about the average. In New Zealand, it's about 10.5 years is about the average. So from that perspective, kind of right on the money.
And it might have been 9. The first year was probably a little bit fast and loose.
Right.
But yeah, call it 9 or 10 years. And so, aside from, my own personal learnings and some of the things I've walked away from Whip Around with, in that sense, it's been a great story, I think. And to sit here and look back at not only everything I've thoroughly enjoyed about what Whip Around brought to me and the lessons learned and the friendships and the people and all the great stuff, which, has no real monetary value. To actually get to the finish line, I sort of underappreciated what that meant because, for a couple of years there, I was very much working on a scenario where the business sort of continued on without me, and that was fine. But I certainly wanted my money out of it so I could go and, recalibrate my life and do the things I wanted to do in terms of starting new businesses and getting involved with other things. Because that is one of the hard things when you're so locked up and,
your wealth is in the business, right?
everything
Yeah.
you've got is in there. And so you're still getting a lot of opportunities, because you're involved in the tech sector. You've got a bunch of experience growing a business. You've got relationships out there. You're in international markets. People do come to you and say, "Shit, I've got this great idea." And you think, that is a great idea. I would love to get involved in that.
Yeah.
But you know what? I've got no money.
Yes.
I am the last person you want to talk to.
And people are like, but you've had this successful business that we
Exactly.
haven't
It
sold.
is a misconception. Yeah, totally. And so, just getting involved in all of that. I've really enjoyed this sort of 10 years I've had in the New Zealand tech space in particular. And, there is a great energy, and I do love New Zealanders' approach to things and how versatile we are in international markets and all that sort of stuff. And it's something I really want to, do forever. I've found something I enjoy. And so back to your question is I wanted to be able to do that and get my money off the table to sort of participate in other things. And so I was sort of comfortable that Whip Around was going to continue without me, and I would, hopefully be able to get out of it in some way, shape or form. And I'd sort of sit on the sidelines and cheer it on, not as a shareholder. And I thought that was going to be fine. But it wasn't until sort of the whole deal came together that I realized the importance of sort of finishing something like that. And I think it would have actually really irked me if I didn't have a finish line in my Whip Around journey. I think that is something that's kind of important, irrespective of the dollars. Starting something and finishing it. And the AKR deal, in essence, I think it's been reported was an investment of this, which may well be true, but ultimately all but 2 shareholders, I think, are out.
Right.
And it's a completely new entity.
Right.
So, it was a sale, as far as anyone's concerned, I think. Admittedly, they're probably pumping a bunch of money into it, but so to put that finish line on it, I think has been a really satisfying thing. Is you spend a lot of time dreaming of, the end of something. And, there's 2 types of people. There's people that want to build multi-generational businesses and never get out of them and sit behind a mahogany desk when they're 60, and good on them. And then there's people more like me, and I'll speak on his behalf, James, that, we started this because we wanted to do all the things that starting a business does and means, but we did start it to try and sell it. And so to be able to sort of get to that finish line and say, shit, we did it. We started it, and all the things that went on along the way we didn't expect, but we're here at the finish line, and we've now exited something. And that's been actually one of the most greatest satisfactions of the whole thing, is going, wow, we did actually get there. You convince yourself the whole time it's never going to happen. The world's going to collapse. We'll go out of business. Something will happen.
There's been a lot of catastrophes over the last few years, and particularly the last few months or so.
But we're sitting there trying to raise a bunch of money in COVID, and I was like, this is it. Yeah, we're not going to be able to raise any money.
Like, well,
you're having
quite the opposite ended up happening, which is that all of a sudden we're throwing money at everything at ridiculous valuations.
Round, and even though people were talking to us from their garage, it did mean you could do more investor discussions in a day because everyone was on Zoom.
Everyone was available.
We weren't having to have 8 coffees a day.
Yeah.
But there were those times where you're sitting there going, right, if we've got to scale this business down to 8 people, who are they?
What does it look like?
How are we going to do it? So you do let yourself think that maybe there's, and until you are at a certain scale and you actually take a step back and go, we've got thousands of customers, and we've got a revenue base, and we've got enough money coming in that we probably actually are quite defensible.
Sustainable.
It takes a long time to get your head around the doomsday scenarios that fly around in your head, but you still have them. And so, getting to that final point is hugely satisfying.
On that final point, as much as you're able to share, to tell us about the deal.
And there's a lot I can't say about the deal. Not that there was any, huge, great color in it or anything like that. All I can say in terms of value, it was reported in public information that it had to get overseas investment office approval, which means that the quantum was north of that $100 million mark, which is about the limit of what I can say there, which is a great result. I think we're really proud of that, and I think as much for our investors, but as for being able to sort of etch our name on sort of a New Zealand tech story, albeit there's some people doing far greater, bigger, larger, smarter things than us. I think something I'll eternally be proud of is sort of making a mark, at a quantum that, at least makes a news headline somewhere on page 3 of
9 figures is meaningful, and Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying a comparison is the thief of joy. That's a great result in anyone's world. And as an investor, an exit of some quantum is great. An exit of a quantum of, I'm guessing that's more than 10x would have gone back to probably all of the investors on that journey, regardless of which stage they're in.
Everyone made money,
Yeah,
certainly.
yeah,
So.
great. Okay, wonderful story. We've talked about the deal. We've talked about the journey of getting there. Let's talk a little bit about Help Genie. What is that, and why did you start it?
Yeah, well, how did I start it? That's always the one. I tend to start things a little bit by accident. But so Help Genie is essentially a voice AI layer, support layer for the physical world. So the simplest way to explain it is we're replacing user manuals and support guides for things that you can touch and feel. So instead of the old user manual for your washing machine or your car or your heat pump at home that lives in a bottom drawer or is long lost, we are wrapping voice AI technology around that. And there's a couple of different sort of ends to that spectrum. So for the consumer, the end user, let's say some of our customers are new home builders. So instead of handing over a new home with a drawer full of user manuals and here's your dishwasher and your heat pump and here's your paint color and how to set your burglar alarm, we have all of that intelligence built into a Help Genie for that property. Hey, what's the paint color on my walls? How do I set my burglar alarm? What's error code 3 on my dishwasher? We provide those answers really quickly. You don't have to go searching
Amazing.
for them, multilingual, all of that.
I love it. Like a digital user manual for the entire home.
Yep,
Love it.
absolutely. And so our customers are not, whilst we're building a product that's really smart and intuitive for the end consumer, the user, our customers are businesses. And the reason Help Genie really exists is because as AI is making a significant impact in the world, we are acutely aware that in that same scenario, most people might jump on ChatGPT and go, how do I change my burglar alarm? Or why is my washing machine making a funny noise? The people that have sold them that or could help service that or repair that problem are completely disconnected with that conversation. And so our customers are the retailers, they're the manufacturers, they're the people that have an interest in understanding what their customers are having issues with. So they get conversation reports and analytics. But most importantly, they're getting the revenue opportunities. So we've got a little unofficial tagline that, Help Genie is really support that sells. And so a lot of support infrastructure is built to support. It'll provide some answers. But if you're talking on and I've tested a million of these, so I know you talk to a support bot on a retail website about why your washing machine is beeping or it's got an error. And you say, look, don't worry about it. This thing's 6 years old. It's actually stuffed and I need a bigger one. It will thank you for the conversation
Right.
and
One
close
try
out.
and sell you another one. Right.
Help Genie
Mhm.
understands that comment, it understands sentiment, and we will then connect that revenue opportunity back to the retailer who has it. So we're sort of working on two sides of the spectrum. We are a new support layer in the middle of the retailer or the OEM or whoever it might be and the consumer. And we do a better job of providing support than a lot of companies do, either with website support pages or manuals. But we're really delivering value back to our customers, the businesses who are missing out on so much aftermarket revenue now because their customers are seeking support way out of their network.
Love it.
Yeah.
So is there anything that we haven't touched on today, like a hot point for you or something which is part of the journey, which is really relevant and useful to the audience?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot. Not really. I mean, the only other thing I sort of, have opinions on, which are probably not actually that relevant, but just how the world's changing, building a SaaS business in 2017, is very different to how the world is operating now. And I think we're in for just, such a different world for entrepreneurs starting businesses, particularly tech businesses, because there is already just this influx of noise out there, and I am part of it. I'm Claude coding my way to email outreach and all sorts of things. And if I can do it, I can assure you there's a lot more people out there that can do it these days. And so how do we, what is the point of difference? What's the cut through for companies now? And going back to my comment about telematics, those partnerships, those trusted relationships, the people who already have the customer base I think they are going to become an increasingly valuable commodity because it's going to become increasingly harder and more expensive. I was out meeting a trades business yesterday for Help Genie, and their biggest problem is how expensive Google ads are getting, because there is just so many more people competing for the same eyeballs, and Google's ramping prices. And so I think, I consider myself a little bit fortunate that SaaS and growth was a little bit simpler even, 5 years ago. And now it's a whole new art form.
Yeah, it's back to that timing thing. This has been a conversation that's been going around the Valley and also around investment circles in New Zealand, is that once the moat was really product, right? So your IP was, a lot of it was contained in your product, a bit in your brand, maybe some even in your people as well. But because of the advent of digital everything now, and conversation agents available on so many different layers, that and I wrote about this just in next week's article, is that a lot of your moat now is actually in your incumbent customer base and through your partnerships. I didn't talk about partnerships, but I mean your customer base. And so the NRR number, the net revenue retention number, is a critical one, which means share of wallet, expansion revenue, land and expand, all these kind of things is absolutely critical. And we're kind of going back in some ways, everything's cyclical. That's going back to the 1980s of, it's 14 times more expensive to get a new customer than it is to look after your incumbent one. And it's ironic because a lot of SaaS has been built on automate every bit of service and obfuscate yourself as much as you possibly can from your customer, make it really hard to get to a human being. And that model's gone now. But I think it's going to take people a while to wake up to it, because distribution, getting cut through to customers, is so hard now and so expensive. And we're just going to switch off so many channels because of the proliferation of digital agents that'll be doing that on our behalf. And spam filters will be worth their weight in gold, that then doing something with what you have and looking after the people again is actually going to become critical, which is a great thing.
And the old school ways of engaging with people. I went to a trade show expo the other day, and it was the most fruitful thing I've done in a while, because we used to call it going guerrilla, apparently, as an industry term in the US, where it's a little bit unacceptable to go to an industry event if you haven't paid to be an exhibitor,
right? And
go and solicit business. And so sometimes if we couldn't afford to go to a show, or we'd missed out on the timeline, we'd sort of nudge, we'll go guerrilla. And you'd have to be a little bit under the radar, but all your customers were the ones that had the booths.
Yes.
And so you'd go and sort of try and, hustle some business. So I went guerrilla to the show here, didn't have a booth, but I would have had 30 conversations with my ICP customer.
Wow.
And, took a quick picture, got a brochure, got a business card. They all answer the phone. And as soon as you say, hey, or you send them a picture, hey, I was at your booth, and I love that, motorhome that you had there, or whatever it is, you've got a conversation. They know that you're not bullshitting them. You're not just an AI outreach. You've sent them something meaningful. And I think those sort of things are going to come back in vogue again, because you're not going to send a Claude agent to a trade show. So, I mean, I love that, because that's what I like doing. I'm far better at walking around having conversations to people than I am trying to hack my way to a, mass outreach campaign.
Yep. I agree with that. So, Tim, we've reached into the conversation. My last question for people is the alternate career conversation. So there's another Tim, he's living in a different universe. He's deeply satisfied by the career that he has found. I'm not going to seed this, but I'm wondering if it might be the thing that our research dug up. And if you don't answer it with this, then I'll drop it in later on. But what's that career that isn't a tech founder that has gone through the scale and exit journey, who's now doing it again in a different business? What's that alternate career?
Probably a pilot. Yeah. No, I love aviation. And
got your PPL and you've flown?
I've started.
Okay.
But it's something that's sort of burning a hole in my mind as I clip away on the years. But no, I love aviation. The big dilemma is, would I go become a helicopter pilot or a fixed wing pilot? But probably a commercial airliner pilot would be the alternative career.
Okay. I think a lot of young men have that dream. I had a neighbour whose dad was a commercial airline pilot for New Zealand, and so I had that conversation with him. And I then had a number of trial flights of different types of aircraft, thinking about actually the chopper was the path that I was going to head down. And I did 2 of these trial flights, and I had a bit of an affinity with the chopper. And then I sat down and had a conversation with myself about, do I want to get this license? Because where am I going to fly? And it was a pretty quick connection between that point and realizing that what I would end up doing was flying my mates to Waiheke or to another vineyard so they could drink, and then I could fly them back home again after they'd had a perfectly wonderful day, because I had nowhere to fly to, right? And so my buddy AP at Emperor, he's got a chopper and he's got a place up in Northland, so he flies from Auckland to Northland, and so that makes sense for him that he flies every now and then to the islands, the bay and that sort of stuff. So he gets some, reasonable use out of it. And he loves the art of flying as well. As he says, though, he's like, I didn't realize I'd have to become a fucking pilot. What do you think? They're just going to give you a chopper?
Yeah.
But
I
the
totally
course of
agree.
getting there, it's $50,000. That's not the hard part. It's the 6 weeks of full-time study that you've got to do in the maintenance of it. But as the where you're going to fly, I think actually, ironically, fixed wing ends up being a lot more kind of accessible, because there's so many more things that you can do with it, right? And the flying is a lot more forgiving. The death rate is quite high with the chopper. And so it's super cool craft though. Have you flown a chopper before? Yeah, it's so good. It's such a cool experience.
They're very, very cool. Definitely the cool side of the flying. But yeah, I agree. I had that same thing. It was like, if I get a helicopter license, what am I going to do? Because I'm either going to have to find out how to own a helicopter, and that's probably
Expensive.
a couple of $1 million if you get the one you want.
Yep.
Or am I going to become a professional helicopter pilot? And then again, you're just flying other people around having a good time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the fixed wing's the way to go. But no, look, some people hate flying. I love getting on a plane. I don't mind sitting on one for 12 hours and, looking out the window.
Yeah, good on you.
Yeah, it's good.
Tim, what a great conversation. Very grateful that you took the time to come on the show, particularly so quick after the deal has been done and announced. So really grateful that you could share your story. And I wish you the best with Help Genie.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Josh. Great to be here, and good work on the podcast. Loving all the episodes.
Pleasure. Thanks, man.
Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to the show. If you've gotten this far, I reckon you've probably enjoyed it. And there's more available for you in the form of my book, 2 Commas. It's available on my website, joshcomrie.com. I've done an Audible version, which is on amazon.com, and there's a Kindle one kicking around on either of those resources as well. I've had some wonderful, unsolicited feedback from early readers. They describe it as being punchy, clear, helpful, and actionable. What it's not is a guide on how to sell your company. You can go to ChatGPT for that. It's more insightful, experiential-based, and a bit of a blend of psychology, philosophy, and what it takes to build something meaningful, and what all that means afterwards. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you grab yourself a copy.